A country doesn't need to be objectively perfect for mass migration desire to form around it. It only needs a stable projection of order, aesthetic consistency, and cultural legibility strong enough to compress complexity into a single, appealing narrative. And the strange part is how easily that narrative survives contact with reality. By 2026, Move to Japan is less about geography and more about psychological escape architecture, where projection bias, novelty seeking, and selective exposure combine to form an idealized system that filters out friction and amplifies coherence. What most explanations get wrong is assuming it is about anime or surface culture. Those are entry points, not causes. The deeper driver is cognitive relief, the perception of structured social rules in contrast to high ambiguity environments elsewhere. And this is where psychology starts to break down. Because when people evaluate another country from a distance, they do not experience it. They reconstruct it from curated signals, media, travel clips, social narratives filtered through availability bias, where memorable examples outweigh statistical reality. But what makes this even more unusual is how strongly order itself becomes a reward signal. Clean streets, punctual systems, predictable interactions, these are not just logistical features. They function as perceptual stability cues that reduce cognitive load during observation. And this detail changes everything. Because the brain does not separate comfort of observation from comfort of living very cleanly. A place that looks structurally consistent is subconsciously inferred to be emotionally and socially consistent as well, even when those layers operate independently. Which leads to a far darker mechanism. Idealization is often built on incomplete exposure. Tourists experience high-control environments, transport systems, commercial districts, curated social interactions, while filtering out administrative complexity, labor pressure, and social constraint structures that exist outside visible zones. And researchers notice something unexpected. The more curated the exposure, the stronger the migration fantasy becomes, because reduced friction increases narrative clarity. This is where cognitive dissonance begins to form silently. Because contradictory information exists simultaneously, high admiration of structure, alongside awareness that structure often implies constraint. The mind resolves this by separating place as experience from place as system, preserving the positive model while compartmentalizing the negative one. But what makes this even more unusual is how social signaling reinforces the desire. Expressing intent to move becomes a form of identity alignment with discipline, refinement, and self-improvement narratives, regardless of actual relocation feasibility. And this detail changes everything. Because aspiration itself becomes performative. The idea of moving functions as a proxy for valuing order, aesthetic minimalism, and perceived cultural sophistication, even if no actual migration occurs. Which leads to escalation through cultural feedback loops. Online communities amplify selective narratives, efficiency systems, etiquette rules, technology integration, lifestyle simplicity. Each reinforces the perception that complexity is lower than in the observer's environment, even when complexity has merely been relocated or made less visible. And this creates a structural illusion, because high-order systems often hide high coordination costs. Predictability is not absence of complexity. It is complexity that has already been resolved upstream through strict behavioral constraints and institutional design. But what makes this even more unusual is how comparison bias operates across cultures. People do not compare full systems. They compare peak visibility moments of one system against median experience of another. And this detail changes everything again. Because once comparison becomes asymmetrical, the conclusion becomes predetermined. One system appears more refined, not because it is universally superior, but because it is being observed under optimized conditions of presentation. Which leads to a deeper psychological layer. Japan, in global perception, becomes a symbol rather than a location, a compressed representation of order, restraint, technological polish, and aesthetic consistency. Symbols are cognitively efficient, so they spread faster than nuanced reality. And researchers notice something even more counterintuitive. The strongest migration desire often appears in individuals seeking internal structure, not external novelty. The destination becomes a proxy for self-regulation rather than exploration. This is where identity projection intensifies, because moving stops being about relocation and becomes about transformation. The imagined environment is expected to enforce discipline, simplify decisions, and reduce social noise, effectively outsourcing self-regulation to geography. But what makes this even more unusual is how friction gets reframed. Language barriers, cultural differences, and work expectations are often reinterpreted as part of the experience, rather than structural constraints that actively shape daily life. And this detail changes everything again. Because the model becomes self-sealing, positive interpretations are reinforced, negative signals are reclassified as temporary adaptation costs, and contradictory data is absorbed without collapsing the underlying narrative. Which leads to a final layer. Actual lived experience in any country includes bureaucracy, social hierarchy, economic pressure, and contextual norms that cannot be fully captured through external observation. But by the time someone arrives, they are already interacting with a pre-built mental model that resists full revision. So the question is not why everyone wants to move to Japan. It is why certain systems become globally selected as vessels for projection, absorbing other people's need for order, clarity, and meaning, until the place stops being a country in the mind and becomes a psychological interface for unresolved expectations about structure itself. And somewhere between the curated feed and the lived street, the difference is always larger than the decision that started the fantasy. So, yeah, like and subscribe, and maybe check if you're moving to a place or just trying to reinstall your own sense of control.